Quilting has been aptly described as a fabric sandwich that unites both art and craft and tradition and originality. Example after example of this unique pageant in cloth and needlework can be found at the National Museum of American History, where the Quilting Collection is part of the Division of Home and Community Life's Textile Collection. The collection originated in the 1890s as part of a gift of household, costume, and personal items, and 3 quilts that belonged to the Kopp family of Stonington, Connecticut.
The 3 quilts that came with that collection date from the 18th through the very early 19th century. The one that is a quilted counterpane has 3 layers. It's indigo blue wool for the top. It has a wonderful quilted pattern. In the center is a pineapple. There's another bed cover in the collection. It's an embroidered counterpane, and it has the same design. There was a member of the Kopp family who drew patterns for the ladies to use for their quilts and their embroidered counterpanes. Another quilt in the collection that's 18th century is a very simple 9-patch design. It has a piece top in the 9-patch pattern, and it's very plain, has very small pieces, very practical quilt. The top is cotton, the filling is wool, and the lining is linen. It's more of a utilitarian quilt, so we're lucky to have it remain because a lot of utilitarian quilts were used and thrown away. The third quilt is a framed medallion that has hundreds of pieces of fabric dating from the 1770s to the very early 19th century. It's like a catalog of the kinds of fabrics that people used for clothing and household furnishings during that time, and it's in a quilt that is pretty dateable. The Kopp family was well off, but the pieces in the frame medallion quilt are as small as 3/8 of an inch across, and so they were a thrifty family as well as a well-off family.
Since that initial gift, the collection has grown to cover 3 centuries of American history. It's a collection that illustrates the boundaries of thrift and extravagance in quilting, and the infinite variety of styles and materials that are the American quilt. And they often provide us with an unusual glimpse of the times in which they were made and prevailing attitudes of an era. Quilts from the 1700s are the earliest surviving American example of this form of historical communication and of the craft itself. They are relatively rare, but the National Collection includes some notable examples.
The earliest dated quilt in our collection was made by Eve Van Cortlandt, dated 1760 and has her initials on the lining, EVC. The top is of fine linen. It's obviously from a well-to-do family. One of the quilts in our collection has a top of a printed and painted palampour made in India, and it was probably used unquilted as a bed cover. From the design, it was probably made around 1775. The lining is a 19th century fabric. The quilting threads are a clue to its being made at a later date as a quilt. Palampour itself has an inscription on it, and it says, "This quilt was purchased 1736 of a smuggler of East India goods in the Isle of Wight, England." It's signed Elizabeth Smith, Charleston. Another quilt in our collection, the center of which was probably made in the 18th century, is a chintz appliqué quilt top. The center was made by Mary Gorsuch Jessup, and the printed fabrics that she used for her appliqué were printed by John Hewson. John Hewson came to this country before the Revolutionary War at the behest of Benjamin Franklin. Franklin persuaded him to come to Philadelphia to set up a factory. Martha Washington is known to have liked his printed fabrics. She even is known to have commissioned a handkerchief with Washington's image on it. Another notable quilt in the collection is made of a blue and white resist-dyed fabric. From the piecing, it appears to be made of recycled bed furniture. There was a lot of fabric to be utilized after the bed hangings were no longer in fashion or had worn out. And so this is an example of 18th century recycling.
Much of what we know about the materials to make the older quilts in the collection is the result of laboratory analysis performed at the museum by specialists in textiles and quilting. Much of what we know of the women of the budding nation, we know through the needlework of those eras. Almost exclusively the work of women, the early quilts reveal evidence about the lives of women in early America that is often not available in other historical records of the times. Like this tombstone quilt made to commemorate the death of a young granddaughter, a common practice of the era. Or this one made for a bride with her rejected suitor's name included in the inscription and a pair of embroidered mittens, a representation of giving the mitten to him. One woman made a quilt to celebrate her husband's membership in the Masons, and one to celebrate his membership in the Odd Fellows. The women quilt makers also used their needlework to comment on the political and societal concerns of their times, like this quilt, made by a patriotic woman whose son was a Union soldier. The quilt contains his name and the names of the president and generals under whom he served. Or this one, to show support for William Henry Harrison's presidential bid with his log cabin campaign symbol. As the 19th century unfolded, increased time and available materials allowed devotees to expand the decorative aspects of quilting, a point substantiated by the National Collection.
An early 19th century crib quilt dated 1806 was made by Charlotte Rowe. She dated the crib quilt and she put the town where she lived, Virgil, New York, in the inscription. She made it for her son John, and it has a very simple 9-patch pattern. It shows the practical bent that continued into the 19th century, but with the time and materials, there were some very elaborate quilts made in the 19th century. For instance, a quilt top that was never finished as a quilt, instead was finished as a bed cover without a lining and inner lining, was made in the Hasbrook family in Kingston, New York, and it depicts a tree of life under which the Hasbrook family, the mother and father, are sitting under a tree. The 4 sons in the family are in boats in a little stream at their feet.
Quilts made by African Americans during the 19th century and before are quite rare. Among the collection's few examples are this applique quilt made by a 16-year-old slave on a Virginia plantation, and this one made by a former slave in Georgia with Old and New Testament passages from the Bible on it. Around the middle of the 19th century, the industrialization of society caught up with quilting in the form of the sewing machine. The sewing machine was used mostly for simple designs and utilitarian clothing. In spite of the novelty of the sewing machine, domestic quilting continued to be primarily handcrafted. The mid-century also saw many new directions in quilting. Quilts like this one were used as educational tools. The maker of this quilt actually used it in astronomy lectures. A notable quilting breakthrough of the mid and late 1800s was crazy patchwork. The patterns were a potpourri of patterns, materials, images, and stitching that made for wild and often humorous quilts. Crazy patchwork bridged quilting over into the 20th century. Edna Force Davis worked on this one from 1897 until 1929. As crazy patchwork subsided, quilting returned to the more traditional patterns of earlier periods, with updated themes, of course. Like this quilt that displays World War II slogans, and this one with Victor, the popular Victor Talking Machine Company trademark.
One of the 20th century quilts in our collection is one made of sock tops by Ada Jones. The sock tops came from a factory. They were the decorative tops that were added to the sock. And the lining she used was fabric that was distributed by the New Deal self-help program to help farm women. In 1963, another member of the family added a printed cotton border to protect the quilt's edges, which they were fraying. The bassinet quilt in our collection was made by Dorothy Overall, and she had won a Pfaff sewing machine. And this bassinet quilt was made on the sewing machine and made of flour sacks. Flour sacks were printed and became very popular with the ladies. They could buy something practical and then have the fabric of the bag to use in quilts. Finally, Ruth Jones Black Patrick started a quilt for her infant son, but by the time he received the quilt, it was 20 years later. So this is the kind of needlework that we have in our collection that should make people who have unfinished things in their closets feel very good.
As quilting continues to grow, future generations will find a textile tableau of America through the eyes of the women who make the quilts. And Americans will always be able to see the results and share in the experience through the National Quilt Collection.